Hi, my name is Margaret Wang, and I'm here today with Dr. John Astin, a professor at Santa Clara University. And today we're going to talk about his upcoming book called It's Not What You Think It Is. So welcome.
Thank you, Margaret. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So my understanding of the book is that you are discussing different approaches to meditation, mindfulness. Tell me a little bit about your inspiration behind it.
That's a great question. Well, I've written a number of books kind of on this basic topic. I've been for decades now practicing, teaching, and doing research on different kind of contemplative meditative practices and integrating that into my work as a psychologist and researcher and professor. And this represents kind of the next step in that work as I see it. Along the way, along my path, if you will, exploring these kinds of meditative practices, this started to show up in my last book, where it started to dawn on me that no matter what kinds of language I came up with to try to describe what I was experiencing in my life in general, the words somehow always seemed to fail. Like they could never fully encapsulate my experience. And of course, words are tied in with our thoughts and our concepts. And so the more I explored that, the more that just became apparent to me that we have this tremendous capacity to think about our experience and interpret it with the concepts and the language and the conceptual categories that we use to sort of characterize all that we experience in life. And despite the power of that and the miracle of it, I would say, that we actually can do that as creatures who have language and concepts, despite that, our capacity to actually really capture and convey experience is, I've come to the conclusion that it's really not possible to fully capture our experience in language and concepts. And so this book really represents my attempt to articulate that and share that. And as a psychologist, what I found interesting is that I think that this has a lot of implications for how we approach our psychological functioning and well-being, and may hold some important keys to helping human beings find greater freedom in their lives in terms of the things that typically they feel challenged by psychologically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And my understanding is that generally here we try to find this experience of happiness. Mm-hmm. And you start to talk about how there are two different approaches. Mm-hmm. One in which you talk about meaning and seeking fulfillment. Mm-hmm. Another in which it's just maybe you're already experiencing it. Mm-hmm. Can you clarify a little bit what you mean by maybe you are happy even though you might not be able to articulate that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. So conventionally speaking, let's say, or ordinary kind of human understanding, I would say, the way we think about searching for fulfillment and happiness in our lives. Basically, the way we go about doing that is we try to accumulate experiences and then set up our circumstances of our life in such a way as to kind of maximize a sense of what we would call happiness and fulfillment and well-being. So if you think about mental emotional states, we have this very broad way of characterizing those as sort of positive and negative, right? Mm-hmm. Same with circumstances. Well, that was a positive circumstance or situation or experience, and this one was less so, negative, if you will. So the one approach to well-being, again, is to try to maximize my experiences and my circumstances in such a way that I feel as if I'm happier and flourishing and have a greater sense of well-being. And all of that's fantastic, right? I mean, by all means, we should try to have as many experiences and create as many circumstances that are in kind of alignment with our particular preferences and our disposition and our inclination, whether that's our work or our relationships. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And so I say in the book that you can think about that as living more skillfully and more artfully as a way of maximizing well-being experiences, if you will, and minimizing those that we find less to our liking, right? So a second approach, though, to well-being, which I would say most people are less familiar with, if they're familiar with it at all, is to really begin to explore what experience itself actually is. What do I mean by that? Well, I said earlier that our kind of typical way we categorize experiences in terms of positive and negative, right? So we know the ones that fall into the positive category typically and the ones that fall into the negative category. And again, the approach number one, we try to maximize the positive and minimize the negative, right? So in the second approach, and really what the book is all about, is, well, let's look a little bit more deeply at these experiences and circumstances that, owing to the labels that we give them through language and concepts, we imagine them to be what those labels tell us, like a positive state is something that's positive and so on. Let's look kind of a little bit deeper beyond what language is suggesting and see if we might discover something, you could say, deeper or more fundamental about experience. And where this ultimately leads to from a well-being standpoint or a happiness standpoint is that we can begin to tap into what I kind of call like an order of well-being that is actually found to be present even in those states of mind and those circumstances that we would conventionally label as, well, I don't like that one, or that's, you know, we would equate with an absence of well-being.
And
right?
we try to avoid those states of being.
That's our general sort of strategy. We either try to avoid them or we try to transform them into something that we imagine to be more positive. Again, all of which is fine. But of course, we also know, every human being knows this, that our capacity to actually control our internal states or our circumstances is a bit like trying to control the weather, right? Pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because if we could really control our thoughts and our feelings and our circumstances, to basically have the ones that we want to have and not have the ones that we don't want to have, then we probably would have figured that out a long time ago, how to do that.
Yeah.
But it appears that human beings haven't figured that out. So what do we do with the fact that our experiences and circumstances maybe are not within our, or at least there's limits on how much we can actually exercise control over them? So can we discover something that is present in the midst of all experience, which then can enable us to feel a sense of fulfillment, if you will, a sense of contentment, a sense of well-being, even in the face of very, very challenging circumstances and experiences. And that's very much what I'm inviting in the explorations in this book.
And in a sense, what I'm understanding or hearing is that we might try to experience without these labels, in a sense, and instead, whatever is being felt is just is. And I'm wondering if you would like to walk me through this. Maybe we could do a practice together.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's said very well in terms of kind of what I'm emphasizing in this work, that we could say, if we wanted to simplify experience, we could say experience has two aspects to it, every experience. It has the label that we give it, the description that we give it. Oh, well, that's fear, or that's sadness, or that's joy, or that's excitement. So those are all the labels, the ways we try to describe and characterize what's happening, right? And then there's actually just the raw, if you will, naked presence of the experience. You could say its existence, its its aliveness, its energy, right? So take two states, one that we would call typically positive, like happiness, joy. There's the label, trying to characterize this thing that's happening experientially. And then there's the pure presence of it, just the fact that it's here. And then take another experience like fear or anxiety, and it, of course, has a different flavor to it, right? It's not the same as happiness and joy. It's got a different taste to it, doesn't it, right?
Yes. Kind of like the sensations that you describe in your book, and how this is kind of related to the cover of your book. With when you look at something, it appears differently when you come closer.
Right, when you come closer. Well, this is a very interesting thing that we would imagine that the more carefully we look at something, the clearer what it is becomes, right? Like, well, the closer I investigate, say I'm looking at this iPad here, you know, the closer I investigate what this is, the more it's going to come into kind of clarity. Oh, well, now I know what it is, right? The more carefully I look at it. Well, that just makes logical sense, right? Well, what's really curious, and we can borrow from the natural sciences here for a moment, that the more carefully I investigate what this is, just as an object, as a physical object, ironically or paradoxically, the less we actually know what it is, right? So I say, well, what is this made of? This material, it's some sort of plastic, and the plastic is made of various molecules that are assembled in a particular way, right? So now I'm looking more carefully at what it is. And then I look at, well, okay, so it's constituted of some array of molecules assembled in this way. Then let me look more carefully again, and then I look at the molecules, and well, what are they made of? Well, I look and I see, well, they're made of atoms and electrons, and then I look more carefully and I see what are those made of, and the deeper I look, the more carefully I look, the less clear it becomes what this is. And we know this in physics, that you talk to quantum physicists, for example, and they can't really tell you what this is. Like, we have a name for it, it's an iPad, right? It's obviously an iPad. But actually, what is it more fundamentally? Well, we can't really say what it actually is. I mean, literally, we cannot say. The hardest of hard sciences cannot tell you what this actually is. It's not clear. And that's the paradox, that we know that it's not clear what it is because we've looked more carefully at it, and we've discovered more and more and more and more about what it is. So you could take the same, let's take this into the human realm. Let's say you're my friend, and I want to really investigate who is Margaret. So I have certain ideas about you because I've known you for some amount of time, and I'm carrying around this sort of description of who Margaret is. But let me look a little bit more carefully. And the more carefully I look, the closer I look at who you are, what do I discover? I discover more and more and more of what you are, of who you are. So I actually, in a certain way, I find out more about what you are, but I actually know less about what you are because you're so complex, you're so multidimensional, you're so vast in what you are. There's so many things that make up who Margaret is that I could never hope to encapsulate who and what you are in my nice little idea that I carry around in my head about who Margaret is. Does that make sense?
Kind of like the idea of, let's say, some kind of negative evaluative state.
Sure.
Anxiety. One might feel tightness in the chest, or restlessness, or one feels that they cannot stop speaking, you know, cannot stop talking. And these are all different experiences, but those are only mere labels.
Correct.
Now, it's kind of like what you were talking about, knowing me as a friend, that as you get to know me more, as you get to understand more what this anxiety is like, the less you really know what that anxiety really feels like.
Exactly, exactly. And here's what's really interesting, which is that in a certain way, I like to say that, let's take anxiety, okay? So we moved kind of from the physical to the the description of a person, and now we're talking about something even a little subtler or more subtle, are mental emotional states. So let's take something like anxiety, right? So here we have a word, all right? Anxiety. It's a label, right? So just as we have a word for this, like the iPad points to something in our experience, right? It refers to something. I'll ask you this question, which is, what does the word anxiety refer to, actually? What is that word pointing to as an experience? What would you say? It's describing something that's familiar, like you know it as a, like, it, you know, if it arises, it's familiar. There's something familiar there, and then you can come up with and I say, how are you feeling? And if you happen to feel that way, you say, well, I'm feeling a little anxious, Dr. Astin. But what is it that you're looking at or experiencing or feeling that you're then labeling? Like, what is it actually that word is pointing to? Does that make sense?
Oh,
as
yes.
a question? Yeah.
And
what would you say?
And then I guess I would say it's an uncomfortable feeling.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just stop there for a moment.
Okay.
So yeah, most people would say that it's not that comfortable, that state. Of course, there's other uncomfortable feelings. So there's something uniquely uncomfortable about anxiety, but we'll stick with the word uncomfortable for a minute. Now, let's look at that. Okay. So when you say something is uncomfortable, describe it as uncomfortable, what is that word pointing to? What does uncomfortable mean as an experience?
Something that is not maybe familiar, yet not quite settling.
Okay, right. So basically, and I won't, like, you know, exasperate you by continuing this line of inquiry, but just to say that what we do typically in a conversation like this, just it's very natural, we've just been sort of conditioned to think this way, is that when I ask you a question like that, what you're going to come up with is additional words to try to describe the experience, right? So, you know, first it's uncomfortable, and then, well, what's uncomfortable? Well, it's unsettling. And then, well, if I could keep going, right? Well, what's unsettling? So what's really interesting is to get to, and this is really in a nutshell what the book is about, is all of those are abstractions. Okay, anxiety is an abstraction. Uncomfortable is an abstraction. I'm not saying that there's not something real there that's not merely abstract, but what's the reality there that those abstract words and concepts are pointing to? Like, what's actually present here that isn't merely an idea? And that gets very, very interesting. And in a sense, in a very real sense, what we start to find is that the actuality of our experience, the real, what's here concretely, is very, very open-ended. It's very, very difficult to define what's here right now. I mean, we could, you know, the old expression, you know, TMI, too much information, right? That's what I would say is here. It's too much information, in a sense, to be able to actually describe what's here. That it's beyond our capacity to put this moment, or any moment, into a neat and tidy kind of framework, interpretive framework. And yet we can use our interpretations, and we do all the time. And you had said something earlier about, you know, what's it like to experience without the labels.
Right.
And what I would say is that that may not be possible. I think it's very difficult, because the labels are like our knowledge of what things are. Like, you always know that anxiety is anxiety, that you've learned that word, that concept. So it's like you can't really take that out once you've learned it, any more than you can unlearn that a tree is a tree, or a human being is a human being.
You need that identifier in some sense.
Well, let's just say that we have it, and it's probably unrealistic to think it's going to go away as a concept that we carry around with us. But what we can learn to do is look at our experience, or I like to say just feel what's here. Feel the presence of what's here, and begin to appreciate the ways in which the felt sense of our experience transcends, if you will, our ideas about it. It goes beyond our ideas. So in a sense, we don't have to get rid of the ideas, and we can't really get rid of them. Like, you don't have to get rid of the label anxiety or the concept,
Yes, yes.
but you can begin to feel what it is.
Beyond it.
Beyond it, in a sense. And you don't even have to go somewhere to get beyond the label. You just stay with what's here, how experience is showing up in your life, in a sense, how it's presenting itself. And it shows you, by its very nature, how it is, and how it is utterly beyond any possibility of really defining it, pinning it down, getting to the bottom of what it is. Oh, I finally got to the bottom of, I know what anxiety, it's this. Or I know what happiness is, it's this. And I would suggest, much like in my example of the iPad, physics, science would basically say, well, we never quite get to the bottom of what it is because, well, it's infinite. It has no bottom to it. It's just more and more depth, more and more detail, more and more subtlety, more and more multi-dimensionality. And I would say the same thing holds for our human experience, that it's, there's so much depth to it, there's so much richness, there's so much subtlety. And one of the beautiful things about this, from my standpoint, is that by just feeling what's here and not letting merely our labels and descriptions define what's here, but touching that which, in a sense, is beyond those labels and descriptions, we really do discover a kind of a richness and a lusciousness and an openness, an indefinability that is really, I was saying earlier when you asked me about the two approaches to happiness, that's what I'm talking about, that there's a richness that's present even in, take a state like grief. Well, we don't typically think like, oh, sign me up, I want more grief in my life, right?
Yeah.
No, I'd just as soon not have to have too many of those experiences. However, so that's at the level of the label and the description, right?
Yes.
Conventionally speaking. But could it be that in something that we call grief, there's actually an aliveness and a richness and a subtlety and and I would suggest that there is, and we discover that by simply feeling the presence of that. And the presence of that is, we can't really say, well, what is grief? Remember when I asked you what anxiety is? I could ask the same question, what is grief?
Yeah. Oh, so you're asking me
Yeah,
now.
I mean...
so I guess it would be an experience of loss and sadness.
Right. But the experience itself, what's that like? Like, what's the feeling tone of it? What's the felt sense of it?
The felt sense would be something heavy, something kind of dank, you know, dark and dank.
Yeah. And what's interesting, though, is that in a certain way, and there's a kind of there's a trick here, which is the questions that I'm posing about what experience is, which is really the central question of the book. What is experience made of?
Yeah.
What's it comprised of? What's the what are all these states of mind made of experientially? There really actually is not an answer to that question, which turns out to be the answer, in a sense. Because any answer would be an attempt to define it, to label it, to characterize it, which is okay.
Yes.
And again, that's partly what we do as humans, as a way of making sense of our experience and then speaking about it with one another.
Yet it's limiting in its these descriptors.
Well, particularly if you think about, conventionally speaking, let's say I'm a psychologist, right, and you were training in that area, which is how I know you as a former student, and when somebody comes to, say, a psychologist for help with something, the typical thing is that they feel as if they're struggling with some aspect of their experience, right? They feel stuck in it in some way, or caught in some aspect of their experience, or troubled by it in some way, and they're trying to break free of that, right? That they feel stuck in a sense, or imprisoned by, or troubled by. And so what's interesting is if the experiences that we think we're stuck in or troubled by aren't actually things that are concretely definable, but are actually this very open-ended presence, energy, vitality, dynamism. In a sense, we can't be stuck in that. There's not something to be stuck in. There's just an experience. And that, of course, is very, very liberating to begin to get a sense of that in one's own experience.
So I'm getting a sense that we are not quite able to articulate what it is we are really experiencing. It can only be felt.
Right. I think that ultimately that's true. You know, we often think in life that, we all know this, there's certain experiences that we just say are completely beyond words, right? Like maybe a moment in nature, or a moment of intimacy with another, something inspiring that happens where we just feel, oh my God, I have no words to describe that, right? And those are usually very often awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
They might be overwhelming potentially too, but I would suggest, and I think one has to just not take my word for it, but look at their own experience in some of the ways we've been talking about. And I think what will be revealed is that that is actually the case with all experience, not just the seemingly fantastic ones or amazing ones, but actually this experience is completely amazing and miraculous and mysterious and unfathomable. And it's only really our language and our conceptual notions about experience that leads us to believe that, oh, well, this is just a couple people sitting in a room and it's nothing that special. But what if that wasn't true?
Like it's an everyday moment.
And it is an everyday moment in a certain way, and yet what we call the everyday moments of our lives are completely inexplicable and indefinable, and owing to that indefinability and indescribability, they are inconceivably rich and vital and alive, and by touching that, we can discover a kind of a well-being that's present in the midst of all of our experience.
So it's we're coming to a close, and I'm delighted that you were able to come today. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure,
Dr.
Margaret.
Astin. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And please look out for It's Not What You Think It Is.